Europe's wildlife just lived through its hottest June ever measured, June 2026, and while every headline covered the human toll, almost nothing covered what happened to the hedgehogs, the badgers, the owls, and the birds that had nowhere to go. That's what this video is about, and it sits at the center of a much larger conversation about climate adaptation, how species, ecosystems, and landscapes respond when the heat keeps breaking records. Start with the numbers, because they're not small. The Copernicus Climate Change Service, working from its ERA-5 climate reanalysis dataset, and the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that 252 weather stations across Europe recorded all-time temperature records during this heat wave, the highest number ever logged in a single event. A June temperature record set back in 1976 had stood for 50 years, and the UK's Met Office confirmed it got broken 3 days in a row this year. More than 1,300 excess deaths across Europe since the heat began. That's the figure the World Health Organization's Director General put on the table, and one detail says everything about how this kind of heat actually kills. 88% of those people were elderly, and they died alone in their own homes. France lost roughly 1,000 people, 85% of them over 65. Heat stress is often called the silent killer. The WHO put it bluntly, because our homes, our workplaces, our schools simply weren't built for these temperatures. None of this is a one-off either. According to Copernicus and WMO data, Europe is warming twice as fast as the global average, and what used to get called a once-in-a-generation heat wave now shows up almost every year, a trend the European Environment Agency has been tracking and flagging in its State of Nature reports for over a decade. So that covers what the heat does to us. Animals face the identical crisis, minus the air conditioning, minus the warnings, minus anyone checking whether they made it through the night. Here's the mechanism, and it's simpler and crueler than most people assume. Every animal, every bird, every mammal, every insect survives heat through thermoregulation, the body's ability to control its own internal temperature. Thermoregulation works two ways: through behavior, like finding shade or water, and through physiology, like panting or sweating to cool down. Severe heat goes after both systems at the exact same time. The shade and water an animal needs are drying up in the same drought that's making it need them more, and the cooling response itself burns through water the animal doesn't have to spare. That's not two separate problems stacking up. That's one problem feeding itself. Researchers sometimes frame this through what's called the heat dissipation limit theory, the idea that every animal has a ceiling on how much metabolic heat it can shed, and once conditions push past that ceiling, the cascade begins. Drop down to the cellular level, and the damage arrives from two directions at once. Dehydration shrinks cells and shuts down their function, while heat stress independently floods the body with damaging molecules called reactive oxygen species. Researchers studying wild-field mice trace this combination straight to the kidney, the liver, and the brain, and the die-offs that make headlines are only the visible layer. Underneath that, animals who survive still lose body condition, breed less, and lose sharpness, a quiet decline with no single dramatic moment attached to it. Australia gives the clearest example of how fast this turns fatal, where a single day of extreme heat wiped out a mass die-off of the endangered Carnaby's cockatoo. Researchers modeling a seabird called the bank cormorant found something just as sobering. As temperatures climb, nesting parents will need to pant for hours a day just to cool down, spending water they can't spare, which forces an impossible choice between staying alive themselves and feeding their chicks. There's a paradox worth knowing here too. Small animals usually hold the advantage in heat since their body shape sheds warmth fast. That same shape means they soak up heat just as fast the moment the air turns hotter than they are. And the trait that usually saves them flips into the thing that finishes them off. Now look at what that actually meant on the ground in Europe this summer. UK ponds and streams lost water and vegetation, leaving voles and hedgehogs. Erinaceus europaeus, the European hedgehog, classified as vulnerable on the UK Red List for mammals, with nowhere left to shelter. Badgers in Scotland turned up dead on roads, killed while traveling farther than usual to find food and water because their staple prey, worms, had burrowed deeper into the dry soil soil to escape the same heat. Wildfire in the northwest killed ground-nesting birds and field voles outright, and that set off a second wave. Predators like the short-eared owl and the kestrel, which depend on those animals, suddenly had nothing left to hunt across the burned moorland. Only the most mobile animals get out, one regional conservation director put it, and this hits right during peak breeding season for a lot of species. A Wildlife Trust chief executive summed up the deeper problem in a single line. When a heat wave drags on, the plant's insects depend on dry up too, and that failure climbs the food chain from there. The UK wasn't alone in this. Belgium's wildlife rescue centers saw a sharp jump in heat-stressed animals, young birds especially. Switzerland's first major heat wave of the year pushed temperatures to 38 degrees, and reports poured in of birds, hedgehogs, foxes, and deer all struggling, made worse by rising water temperatures in the Rhine and the Alpine lakes. Spain's already dry summer pushed reservoir levels under real strain, and in urban areas across the continent, the urban heat island effect made things measurably worse. Cities running several degrees hotter than the surrounding countryside, with far less shade, water, or cover for any animal trying to find relief. Even farm animals didn't escape it. Close to 6,600 farm animals, most of them chickens, died from heat stress during the previous record-breaking summer, simply while being transported to slaughterhouses across England and Wales. That's the damage from this heat wave, and it's real, documented, and getting more frequent. There's a separate story worth telling alongside it though, not a fix for the heat itself, but something that's been quietly helping with a related problem: drought. And it isn't a new invention, it's an old one coming back. Beavers, castor fiber, the Eurasian beaver, vanished from the UK more than 400 years ago, hunted out completely. New government rules finally allowed wild releases again in 2025, and by this year around 100 beavers were set to go free, with dozens more project sites already in the pipeline. The National Trust carried out England's first licensed wild beaver release at its Purbeck Reserve in Dorset in March 2025, with further releases since at its Holnacote estate. The timing lines up almost perfectly. Last year ranked among the driest in a very long time, records falling everywhere you looked, and as lake levels dropped, the beavers responded by building canals on purpose, carrying water into the ground that had dried out. That's how one person working on beaver reintroduction described it. Organizations like the Beaver Trust and Rewilding Britain have been central to making that happen, advocating for the policy changes, running the on-the-ground projects, and helping landowners figure out how to live alongside animals that don't ask permission before they start engineering. West London gives the clearest example. A small group of beavers went into a site called Paradise Fields, West London, back in 2023, and by their second winter there, the target area saw no flooding for the first time in a decade. The wetland ecosystem services they delivered did more than manage water too, drawing in birds, butterflies, bats, and fish that hadn't shown up there before. Beaver wetland ecosystems work because water can percolate into the surrounding dry ground during a drought. One researcher who studies this explained, "What beavers are providing, in the language used by policymakers and ecologists alike, is natural flood management, a nature-based solution that costs nothing to run once the animals are there. People in the field even have a saying for it: if you've got a problem, there's a beaver for that." The numbers back that up. One Canadian river system showed 60% more open water present during drought in stretches where beavers were active, compared to stretches without them. Devon told a similar story from the opposite direction, where a separate trial found beaver activity cut flood flows by up to 60%, even after heavy rain. Same animal, same simple behavior, slowing water down and holding onto it, and it buffers both extremes, flood and drought, using nothing but branches, mud, and instinct. Beavers aren't a response to a heat wave, they're a response to drought, which is a related but different problem. And right now, they're only doing it at a small, scattered scale. It isn't free of consequences either, since some landowners have raised real concerns about flooding on neighboring land or damage to crops and infrastructure. Still, as a working example of what actually holds water through dry conditions, nothing else comes close right now. Which brings us to the part that isn't just information, it's something you can act on. The simplest move costs nothing and takes a minute. Put out a shallow dish of fresh water in your garden and keep it changed regularly. Drop in a few stones so insects have something to land on while they drink. Fresh water every day counts as one of the most important things a person can do to help wildlife make it through summer, a hedgehog charity's chief executive said during this exact heat wave, and every garden, in her words, can become a lifeline. Beyond that, smaller changes add up across a year. Let part of the lawn grow wild instead of mowing it. Plant native species since they need less water and support the local insects. Dig even a small pond with a gently sloping edge. Collect rainwater so there's a supply ready when the taps are under strain. Skip the pesticides too, because they contaminate the very water sources animals are already struggling to find clean. Want to back the bigger version of this, the beaver scale version? Organizations doing exactly that work exist right now. The Beaver Trust and Rewilding Britain both have direct ways to support the projects and the policies pushing for wetland ecosystem services to come back at scale. Every garden pond, every patch of unmown grass, every rain butt does a small version of the same thing beavers do at a larger scale through natural flood management, slowing water down, keeping it in the system instead of losing it. It won't undo a heat wave. But it's real, it's available to almost anyone, and it adds up. Europe just came through its hottest June on record, and the wildlife around us paid a price most people never watched closely enough to notice. There's no single fix for that, and nothing in this video changes the heat itself. What's actually in your control is smaller and closer to home. A dish of water, a patch of grass left alone, a pond dug where there wasn't one before. None of it is dramatic, all of it helps.